The evening air was thick with tension. Clara could feel it in her chest as she sat at the dinner table, her eyes avoiding her family's gaze. Her mother was absent from the conversation, a noticeable coldness hanging between them, but her father and brother, both eager to agree with whatever she said, were too caught up in their own opinions to notice. "Are you sure about this?" Her father's voice was low but firm, his gaze steady on her. "We need to be certain." Clara nodded, though doubt was already starting to creep into her mind. Just an hour earlier, she had accused Mark of creeping on her during the neighborhood party. He had stood too close to her for comfort, looked at her in a way that felt invasive. At least, that's what she had thought at the time. The heat in the room seemed to intensify with every word. Her father's sharp eyes never left her face, as though he could read the turmoil inside her. "Are you absolutely sure?" he asked again. Clara swallowed. Her throat felt dry, her words harder to find. "I saw him staring at me. He kept following me around, standing too close. It made me feel uncomfortable. I don't know what else to say." Her brother, James, leaned in slightly, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure it wasn't just in your head? You know, sometimes, people don't mean things the way we think they do. Maybe you just misunderstood." She wanted to scream at him. Of course she wasn't imagining it. She wasn't the one who misread the situation. It was him. It was Mark. She had seen it in his eyes. "No. I'm not mistaken. He was creepy. He was always too close. Always lurking around. It was obvious." Clara's voice shook slightly, but she tried to remain strong. Her father's face tightened with concern. "You're certain? We can't take this lightly." Clara's eyes flickered to her mother, who had yet to speak. Her mother sat there quietly, her arms crossed over her chest. There was something unsettling about the way she was watching her daughter, almost as if she was waiting for Clara to change her story. "Mom?" Clara asked, voice shaking. "What do you think?" Her mother hesitated for a moment, then spoke, her voice measured. "I don't know, Clara. I'm not saying I don't believe you, but..." Clara could feel her stomach twist. That "but" was too familiar. Her mother's doubts were always wrapped in those simple, loaded words. "But what?" Clara pressed, her tone sharper now. Her mother sighed. "Just think it through. Mark is a good man. He's always been respectful. Are you sure he intended to make you feel uncomfortable, or is it possible you're overreacting?" Clara's blood boiled. Overreacting? Did she really have to explain every little detail? Did she have to justify herself again, for the millionth time, to a mother who had always questioned her? "Mom, I'm not overreacting. I swear. I'm not just being paranoid. He was acting strange. And now everyone's making excuses for him. Do you think I'd make something like this up?" Her mother didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at her father, whose eyes were now narrowed, deep in thought. Clara felt the guilt seep in. Had she made a mistake? What if Mark really didn't mean anything by it? What if it was all just in her head? But then, what about how she had felt? The uncomfortable pressure she had felt when Mark's eyes lingered on her for too long? The silence was suffocating. Clara could see it in her mother's eyes. Her doubts weren't helping. Clara had never been good at standing up for herself, but now, it was a matter of truth. She couldn't back down. Not now. "I'm not wrong," she muttered under her breath. "I can't just pretend it didn't happen." Her father stood up from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm going to speak to him," he said curtly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Dad," Clara began, her voice breaking, "please, don't. Don't speak to him. He's going to twist it. You know he will. I'll handle it. I'll make sure everyone knows he's not welcome anymore." Her father paused, his hand on the doorframe, as if weighing his words carefully. "This is a big accusation, Clara. Think about it." Her mother's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "We'll get through this, honey," she said, her voice almost a whisper. But there was an undertone of uncertainty. Clara stared at her plate, her fork clenched tightly in her hand. She had never felt more alone. Her father's voice drifted from the hallway, but the words no longer held any meaning. She had already made her decision. And now, Mark would pay the price. Hours later, after her family had retired for the night, Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a jumbled mess. Mark had lost his job. She had seen the news online. The scandal spread faster than she had expected. She had played a part in it. She couldn't deny it. The gnawing guilt she had brushed off earlier was now a solid weight in her stomach. Was he really guilty? She remembered his awkwardness, the way he lingered too long, how his smile never quite reached his eyes. He had always been quiet, but was that enough to accuse him? But what if he was guilty? What if everything she had said was true? Her mind refused to settle. There was no clarity. Only the sinking feeling in her chest, the realization that she had become part of something irreversible. Mark's life was falling apart, and she couldn't stop it. It was already too late. In the distance, she could hear her mother sighing, perhaps even crying in the next room. Clara had no idea what to say. How could she apologize for something like this? How could she fix it? Clara's guilt continued to fester over the next few days, creeping into every corner of her mind. She found it harder and harder to concentrate on anything, even simple tasks. Every time she glanced at her phone, the news about Mark seemed to be everywhere. His job had been terminated, his reputation tarnished, and the whispers about what he had supposedly done became more venomous with every passing hour. Her family tried to pretend like everything was normal, but Clara could feel the tension. Her father's eyes held a constant look of suspicion, as if he was waiting for her to break and admit that she might have made a mistake. Her brother, James, barely spoke to her anymore, his disappointment apparent in his silence. Even though they hadn't said it outright, Clara could feel the weight of their judgment hanging between them. It was harder to ignore her mother's disapproval, though. Clara had always felt that her mother looked at her with a certain distance, but now that distance seemed to have grown into an insurmountable chasm. They hadn't spoken much in the past few days. Her mother had remained mostly silent, occasionally offering vague reassurances that Clara wasn't a bad person, but Clara could tell that something was off. Sitting at the kitchen table one afternoon, Clara stared at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her, feeling the emptiness settle inside her. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she reached for it with a sigh. The notification was from a mutual friend, someone from the neighborhood group chat. "Have you heard? Mark's sister is planning to confront Clara about what happened. She's furious. And apparently, he's left town." Clara's heart sank. She had known that things would escalate, but she had hoped that Mark would have simply accepted the situation and moved on. She had assumed that his life would return to normal in time. She hadn't expected his family to turn on her like this. A voice broke her from her thoughts. "Clara, we need to talk." Her mother's voice was sharp, and Clara looked up to see her standing in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "Mom," Clara said, her voice low, not sure what to expect. "I don't want to hear any more excuses, Clara. You've made a mess of things. You ruined someone's life. And you're not even the least bit sorry." Clara felt the sting of her words hit her like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond, but her mother raised her hand, silencing her. "No, don't speak. You need to think about what you've done. Mark may have made you uncomfortable, but that doesn't give you the right to destroy him. Do you understand that?" Clara opened her mouth, but no words came. She didn't know how to explain what had happened, how she had felt so certain at the time. How the discomfort in her chest had seemed so undeniable, so real. But now the weight of the consequences pressed down on her with an unbearable force. Her mother sighed, her shoulders sagging in defeat. "I'm not going to tell your father. He already has enough on his plate with work, but this is on you. You have to take responsibility for it." Clara nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. She couldn't bear to look her mother in the face. It wasn't just about the accusation anymore, it was about everything that had led her here. It was about the years of feeling inadequate, of doubting herself, of needing to be heard but never knowing how to do it without overreacting. She had thought, in that moment with Mark, that accusing him would somehow give her the validation she needed, that it would make the discomfort she felt more real. But now, she wasn't sure about anything. Her mother's voice broke her thoughts. "You need to fix this, Clara. You can't just walk away from it and pretend it never happened." "Fix it?" Clara whispered, almost to herself. "How can I fix something like this?" "You start by apologizing. You need to go to Mark's family. You need to own up to what you did." Clara flinched at the suggestion. Go to Mark's family? What if they hated her? What if her apology only made things worse? But deep down, she knew her mother was right. She had to face the consequences, no matter how painful it might be. Later that evening, Clara sat at the kitchen table once more, her phone in front of her. She had tried to reach out to Mark's sister, but there was no reply. She didn't know what she had expected. Was she supposed to expect forgiveness? Was there even any chance of fixing the damage she had caused? Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her brother. "Clara, I need to talk to you. We'll never be able to move forward if you keep pretending like nothing happened. You hurt someone. And you've hurt me." Clara's heart clenched as she read the message, but she didn't reply immediately. She couldn't. She couldn't face him, not yet. The night dragged on, and as the darkness settled over the house, Clara could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her even more. She could hear the faint sounds of her parents talking in the living room, but her mind was too loud, too overwhelmed with guilt to make sense of anything they said. She closed her eyes, wishing for some form of escape. But no matter how much she wished, there was no easy way out of the mess she had made. She had taken a life, Mark's life, and in the process, she had unknowingly taken her own peace. When Clara finally closed her eyes to sleep, she knew that the confrontation with Mark's family was inevitable. She had to face them. She had to face the truth. But what if the truth was more than she could bear? That night, as she lay in bed, Clara realized something she hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't just about her mistake with Mark. It was about everything she had hidden from, everything she had ignored. She wasn't just sorry for accusing him, she was sorry for how long she had lived in denial about herself. The next morning, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the phone in her hand. The guilt from the past days still hung over her like a storm cloud, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just Mark's life that had been ruined, it was her own, too. She had made a terrible mistake, and no matter how much she tried to apologize or fix it, she couldn't undo what she had done. But today was the day. She had made the decision. She was going to go to Mark's family, face the consequences of her actions, and hopefully, in some small way, start the long journey toward redemption. Clara could already imagine the look on his sister's face when she arrived at their door. Anger. Disappointment. Maybe even hatred. She could feel it all in the pit of her stomach, but she didn't care. She had to face it. If she didn't, she would be forever trapped in the cycle of guilt, never able to move forward. She called an Uber and made her way to the address she had found online. The ride was painfully quiet, every minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. Clara's hands gripped the seat, her heart thumping loudly in her chest. What would she say? How could she explain herself? How could she make them understand that it had been a mistake, one that had spiraled out of control before she had even realized it? The car finally stopped in front of a modest house on a quiet street. The door was slightly ajar, and Clara could see movement through the window. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a brief moment, she thought about turning back. But there was no turning back now. Taking a deep breath, Clara stepped out of the car and made her way up to the front door. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorbell, and when the chime sounded, it felt like the echo reverberated through her entire body. A moment later, the door opened, and Clara was met with the sharp gaze of Mark's sister, Sarah. The woman's face was a mixture of suspicion and anger, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her voice cold and clipped. I'm here to apologize," Clara stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made a terrible mistake, and I need to make it right. Please, just let me explain." Sarah's expression didn't soften, but she stepped aside, allowing Clara to enter. The house was quiet, the air thick with tension. Clara could hear the faint sound of footsteps from the hallway, and then Mark's mother appeared. She looked just as angry, her eyes narrowing when she saw Clara. "Why are you here?" Mark's mother asked, her tone sharp. I need to say I'm sorry," Clara repeated, her throat tight. "I accused Mark of something he didn't do, and I ruined his life. I know I can't take it back, but I need you to know it wasn't intentional. I was wrong, and I'll live with that mistake for the rest of my life." There was a long silence, the weight of Clara's words hanging in the air. She couldn't look either of them in the eye. The shame was too much. The guilt that had consumed her for days now felt unbearable, and she wondered if her apology would even be enough. Sarah's gaze softened just a fraction. She stepped forward, her arms uncrossing. "You ruined my brother's life, Clara. He's lost everything because of you." "I know," Clara whispered, tears threatening to spill over. "I know I can never fix it, but I'm sorry. I wish I could take it all back. I'm sorry for the pain I caused." Mark's mother, still standing in the doorway, sighed deeply. "It's not just about the apology, Clara. It's about trust. You made a decision that had consequences. You accused him of something terrible, and now he has to live with that stigma. He's been humiliated. His career is gone. Everything he worked for is gone." Clara's heart sank further, if that was even possible. She had known the consequences of her actions, but hearing it from them, hearing the devastation in their voices, was too much to bear. "I know," she said again, her voice breaking. "I didn't think about the consequences when I made the accusation. I didn't think about how it would affect him or anyone else. I was selfish, and I let my emotions cloud my judgment. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." There was another long pause before Sarah spoke again, her voice softer now but still laced with anger. You don't get to undo the damage, Clara. You don't get to pretend it never happened. I'm not pretending, Clara replied quickly, her voice stronger now. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking you to forget what I did. I'm just asking for a chance to make it right, to somehow show you that I understand the gravity of my actions. And if I can't fix it, then at least I can apologize. Mark's mother studied Clara for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, she spoke. Apologies don't bring back what he lost. But I suppose they're a start. Clara felt a glimmer of hope, a small sliver of relief. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe, just maybe, she could begin to heal from this, too. I'll do whatever it takes to help Mark, Clara said, her voice steady. I can't fix the past, but I can help him with the future. If there's anything I can do, anything at all, I'll do it. Sarah's eyes softened a little, but there was still a trace of bitterness in her voice. I don't know if that's enough, Clara. But we'll see. Clara nodded, stepping back toward the door. Thank you for letting me say this. Thank you for hearing me out. As Clara left the house, she felt a strange mix of emotions. It wasn't the relief she had expected, but there was a sense of closure. Mark's family wasn't going to forgive her right away. They weren't going to forget. But at least she had owned up to her mistake, and maybe that was a step in the right direction. She didn't know what the future held or if Mark would ever be able to move past this, but Clara knew that she had to live with her actions for the rest of her life. The guilt would always be there, but she also understood that she couldn't let it define her. She couldn't let one mistake ruin everything. The journey ahead would be long, and Clara knew it wasn't going to be easy. But today, for the first time in days, she felt like she had taken a step toward redemption. It wasn't much, but it was enough.